Awesome. Welcome everyone who is either able to join us or watch us after the fact. My name is Christopher Clark. I'm your Outreach and Engagement Librarian here on campus. And right now we are doing an interview, which is another in our series of interviews where we talk to cool people who do cool things. And today's cool person is Rich Vreeland, who ties the name Disasterpeace to the things he sends into the sonic ether. Disasterpeace has over 50 albums to its credit, in addition to having designed, scored, and programmed sound and music-related things in a number of mediums, including games, film, television, and theater. So yeah, welcome, Rich.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. So one of the reasons I reach out to you to just kind of have a conversation is I really love your music, and I first encountered it. It was funny because well, technically, I probably first encountered it in Hyperlight Drifter without realizing it at the time. But then I noticed it in particular in It Follows, which was just such a, like, the music for that film just added so much to it, and you have such a unique sound.
Thank you.
I guess, yeah, totally. And I wanted to ask about your sound in particular, like in terms of, like, I guess what influenced it. What would you kind of describe that as to people who may not be familiar with that kind of sound, I guess?
The sound of It Follows, or me more broadly?
Just, yeah, you're broadly, and then maybe if you want to talk about It Follows specifically, you can.
Sure. So I mean, the influences for me are kind of all over the map and have evolved over time. I would say with It Follows, I'll talk about It Follows first. So with It Follows, that was my first feature film project, and coming into it, I didn't really have a lot of familiarity with horror music or horror films. I had a couple of touchstones, like the theme from Psycho. I had briefly tried to watch The Shining when I was younger and kind of had to run away. But from the musical side of things, I was pretty into the band Goblin, who are affiliated with Dario Argento, and done some different Italian films in that genre. And so those are kind of my main touchstones for that movie, and a lot of what else came out of that had to do with the director David Robert Mitchell and the editor Julio Perez, who put together the temp score for the film, and it had a lot of music in it that I wasn't familiar with, and so I was inspired by a lot of that material. There was material by Christoph Penderecki and John Carpenter and Square Pusher, Trent Reznor. And then of course there was actually a lot of music from a game that I had scored called Fez, which was a very different kind of project. So that project was kind of an amalgam of all of these different things, as well as my own personal affinity for Ennio Morricone, which kind of came in some of the more like titular music, like the theme song and stuff like that. And so, and that's kind of been, like, I guess in general, I try to let myself be influenced by lots of things, and I don't know, maybe just naturally, I gravitate towards different things at different times. When I was younger, when I first started playing music and playing guitar, I was really into guitar-based music, so lots of rock and metal, progressive rock, stuff like that, and then kind of went through different phases. Got into soundtracks, got into classical music, impressionism, minimalism, jazz, later bossa nova, electronic music. So, and then also like all the other mediums too, like in Hyperlight Drifter, towards the end of that project, when I was really struggling, I got a copy of the Hayao Miyazaki manga Nausicaa, and actually just reading that and like inhabiting this this like otherworldly atmosphere really motivated me and inspired me to write music for that project. And so, yeah, I'm inspired by a lot of different things, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Especially when you brought up Nausicaa, because I can like, because even though I'm not like musically minded, like I can totally, I can sense that now, right? Like in the texture of that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
So what was it that kind of got you into like musical composition in the first place? Like, was there,
Mm.
yeah, what was it about that that just kind of like drew you into that field?
Well, it started before that because I was always really motivated to make stuff ever since I was pretty small. And it primarily started with drawing and making up fictional entities, making up fake companies. I remember like going onto relatives' computers and opening up Microsoft Word templates and like the Vreeland Corporation or something, and like use like certificate of authenticity or something. And I was like 7 years old, and then I was making like fake newsletters for my street. Like I was always doing stuff like that. I got really into making logos, and um, further down the road, got really into creative writing and had this whole kind of romance with e-wrestling, which is like competitive fan fiction for wrestling when I was a teenager. And that sort of gravitated into me doing freelance work, because that's kind of how I got my start doing freelance work, making graphics and websites. And then I started doing like entrance music for wrestler, like, for fictitious wrestlers. And that all kind of like, there's some kind of progression there between that and kind of stumbling into doing music as a profession. So, and I grew up in a musical household, and maybe because of that, I was actually more interested in other things first. And it wasn't until later that I actually started getting more into music. Like high school, I would say, is when I actually started to play guitar and start to write music, and the same sort of feedback loop that I loved so much of making things and interacting with them, and also like seeing what other people thought of them. I always was really compelled by, even when people didn't like what I did, I found all of it to be really interesting, I guess. And I felt like when I started writing music, I felt like I had a lot of energy for it, as if I had been around people making music and playing music forever, and I just never really tried to do it myself. And so in the beginning especially, it was kind of like just the floodgates opened, and I had like so many ideas, and just like tried to find ways to get them, to jot them down.
Yeah, no, it's so funny that you bring that up, because that just really hits home, like in a special way for me. Like we're talking about like the Vreeland Corp and all of that stuff, because this memory of being a kid and just making up these completely of like Oscar pictures that that my brother and I would do award shows for, that didn't, we just completely made up just to make things up, right? So
Yeah.
that makes a ton of sense. So you mentioned kind of getting your start with like in terms of the freelance work and stuff. What was your journey like in terms of like, and you kind of touched on this a little bit with influences, but just in terms of like finding I guess your sound or your particular genre of music?
I think it was never there was never really a overt kind of thing that I was looking for. It was always just, whatever I was into at a particular time seemed to have the biggest influence on what I was doing. So when I was in the beginning playing guitar, I borrowed a Metal Zone pedal from my stepfather, and we had an amp in the basement that was my grandfather's that he'd never used, and I basically just had those and like a cassette deck, and I would just record myself playing riffs, like really like distorted drop D guitar riffs, because I was really into new metal at that time, and then got into slightly more sophisticated new metal. Going from like Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park to like, I don't know, Tool and Rage Against the Machine. And then, but I was also into like Led Zeppelin, and I was taking guitar lessons and learning lots of Led Zeppelin tunes. My stepfather was really into the Beatles and had a Beatles cover band called the Blue Meanies, and so that was always around. Uh, what was the question? I lost my train of thought.
Oh no, yeah, no worries. That kind of answered it. It was just kind of like asking, I guess, about your journey to finding your sound. That.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's I just in the beginning it was what can I play,
Mhm.
and it was influenced a lot by what I thought was were the coolest things that I had heard at that time, which was Tool and Rage Against the Machine. Basically, I was like, these are the coolest bands ever, and so a lot of what I was doing was riffs, odd meters, lots of like Phrygian kind of stuff, Phrygian riffs or something, and then and pentatonic type stuff. And then that over time, it kind of graduated and evolved to include other influences. And that just kind of has continued, I would say, throughout my entire career, as I've like discovered more and more things that were really inspiring to me. You know, I can remember when I started reintegrating my interest in video games and the music, like became a big part of that, especially the music of like Yasunori Mitsuda, who did like Chrono Cross and Chrono Trigger, and Koji Kondo, who did, you know, obviously Zelda and Mario stuff. Um, and then, you know, getting into classical music was a big deal. You know, discovering minimalism was huge for me. I got to see Music for 18 Musicians live at Carnegie Hall on, I think it was Steve Reich's 70th birthday, and that was like, I was probably 19 or 20 when I saw that, and that was pretty ground shifting for me to see that, and it had a profound like effect on my music. And you can definitely hear it like in like I had an album around that time called Level that I wrote, and that has a lot of like minimalistic influences in it. And then later I got into impressionism, and you can hear a lot of that in Fez and Hyperlight Drifter. But also got really, you know, got more into jazz. I mean, there was always jazz like in some way, like in my household, but primarily it was through Charlie Brown. And then as when I was older, I got more into jazz, and you know, got into like modal jazz a lot, and mid-century type stuff, and then through that got into like Brazilian stuff, and you know, like Jobim and all these other things. And I mean, it's funny going to Berkeley for music, Berkeley College of Music. I was going and applying for electronic music program, but I didn't really listen to electronic music. I listened to like bands. And so it was a little bit weird. There was always a little bit of a disconnect for me. But I think being there and being in that space is actually what introduced me more to electronic music, being around other people who are really into, you know, Square Pusher and um, folks like that. So
Awesome. Yeah, and you mentioned kind of like just like yeah, like getting more into jazz and stuff. Was that like did that make for a fun experience when you were doing Under the Silver Lake? Because like where you have kind of that kind of I guess noirish jazzy aspect to it.
yeah, yeah, I think that was a great project for me creatively because I had, you know, I had studied jazz harmony in school. I had always liked jazz in some capacity and had some sort of like understanding of the language of it. And uh, I had done a few things like professionally and creatively before Under the Silver Lake that helped me kind of inhabit that space. Like I participated in a Kickstarter that was like a chiptune cover or chiptune arrangement of Kind of Blue, the Miles Davis record.
Mhm.
And I had done some like noir-ish video game stuff. I did these games called Puzzle Agent for Telltale that were like, you know, there were some similar kind of colors in there.
Mhm.
But going into Under the Silver Lake, I didn't have much familiarity with the genre. So I watched like a bunch of movies and like Vertigo and Taxi Driver and Blue Velvet and what's the big one? Citizen Kane. And that was my introduction to Bernard Herrmann's music that I had never really, I had heard his music before, but I never really knew of him. And that's right up there with like, like my discoveries of minimalism and impressionism and all the other stuff I mentioned, as far as like being really inspired by that music. And I think that's part of like why that project worked for me, is because of how interesting I found the space to work in.
Yeah, no, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I do want to ask, just because you've mentioned kind of like working on scores for films and video games and whatnot. Like how like is your approach different depending on the medium? Like do you approach scoring a film differently than you approach scoring a video game, just because they do kind of function differently?
Yeah, there's some there's some fairly large differences that generally have to do with the time, like the scheduling and the timelines of these projects. I mean, film tends to be there tend to be more people involved, and the burn rate tends to be higher, so the development time tends to be shorter. So, and also they tend to be it's the film's sense of itself tends to be more solidified around the time that I'm getting involved, and so there's less in flux, which makes it a little easier to kind of target things, because you're not the ground, like the rug isn't being pulled out from under you as much as it can be in game development, because of the iterative kind of cycle of development in games. Sometimes it takes a while for a game to really know what it is, its own identity. So sometimes getting involved early can actually be quite challenging. And I've been in that situation before, where I just didn't really know I didn't know what the game was. So it made it fairly difficult to try to capture the essence of something if it doesn't really know what it is. So with games, there's a desire for me, at least, to try to get to save a lot of the heavy lifting towards the end, when things are more solidified. So in some ways there tends to be a certain amount of crunch, as far as like, just maybe not actual crunch, but just having a more condensed timeline towards the end of a project, where you have to work a little bit harder. But games usually take longer too. So, I mean, I've been currently I'm working on Solar Ash, and I've been working on that for over 4 years. And that's not totally unusual. So, but at this stage of my career, I'm hoping to work on some shorter projects.
Sure.
I'm running out of years.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like when you're working on something for that period of time, like you mentioned, kind of having a more condensed time frame near the end, but like, do you feel like the how should I phrase this? I guess, do you feel like the sound stays pretty consistent, or do you feel like you end up changing it partway through the process, like as things become more solid?
Yeah. If the identity of it is really shifting, then yes, I would say that my work would probably shift as well. There's other issues, like if you're involved with something for years, I mean, you're literally like changing as a human being, like quite dramatically. If you're on something for multiple years, so that can be challenging. As far as, I've been on projects where I wrote something really early on, and fortunately, the game, like Hyper Light Drifter, the game had a general sense of itself, in at least the broader sense, and that allowed me to like kind of write something that conceptually worked well for the project, and we still ended up using it at the very end, even though everything else was in flux, like the levels and the kind of the narrative structure and all that kind of stuff. So that was challenging in the sense that, I had to kind of maintain a certain level of consistency. And it's easier to do that when you're just inhabiting, you're in the flow, like you're working on it, every day or so. It's a lot easier to kind of stay in the ballpark than it would be to like take a year off or something and then come back. That's definitely can be challenging.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I, um, I guess, are there any particular like, I guess like tools of the trade that you use, right? Like what are your kind of go-to in terms of like actually composing and then like going back and kind of figuring out sounds like.
Hmm. I do a fair bit of writing at the piano.
Mm,
I don't always use the music that I write at the piano, but it's a part of my process a lot of times to just start to interface with the thing that I'm trying to write music for. And so it can help me to like start to discover the language of something. But then like actual writing or like actual producing, I will do in the DAW. And I've been using Logic Pro for the last, I don't know, 12, 13 years. And yeah, I like to experiment with creative process as much as I can.
mhm.
But I also try to do things in a way that is pragmatic for the project at hand. And so, um, yeah, as something like Under the Silver Lake was a project where normally I'm taking maybe one step out of my comfort zone, and that was like multiple steps out because I was doing a working with a real orchestra, which I'd never done before, working in a new style. So I had to figure that out, and fortunately I didn't do it alone. I had a team. I had a score producer, Kyle Newmaster, and he helped me a lot with the logistical side of that, and also like being a sounding board so that I could have someone to talk to about the process and make sure that I was making good choices with the music. So I just focused on writing the music and making it sound generally how I wanted it to sound. And so for me, I didn't think that I could, or that I really wanted to like go back to school essentially and like get a bunch of textbooks on orchestration or something like that and start notating. Um, that wasn't really my idea of a good time. So I did what I thought I could do in that context, which is, get some sample libraries and just try to hack it together. And it mostly worked out, I think. It definitely limits you in certain ways, but um, yeah, and those more serious projects, try to hone it in. When it's more light, I'll probably experiment more and do weirder things. Like I've come up with songs just by like, you know, I don't know, like slapping a rhythm on something, and then I'll use that, or I'll whistle some weird melody that I won't even use the melody, but I'll use the contour and the rhythm. Sometimes I mess with flashcards of like pitches and try to come up with like weird chord progressions or stuff like that. I'm always like playing around, and I've done a fair bit of like procedural music projects too. So all of that is like there, and it's I'll definitely tap into that at times and try to incorporate it in ways that are, like I said, pragmatic, because it's not always pragmatic to start doing some crazy procedural thing for something that doesn't really need it.
Right, right. So like when you're tackling a project,
Mm.
so like I guess how much does like the genre of that project influence you? So, like something like It Follows, where it's more horror and versus something like a video game that might be more like science fiction, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it definitely influences it a lot. I think I'm comfortable working within like a broad set of expectations.
Mm,
I'm less comfortable working within a very specific set of expectations, maybe.
mm,
I want to have some flexibility to kind of explore and do something slightly different. It's easier to do something different when I'm stepping into a space that I have no very limited familiarity with and I'm somewhat ignorant. And so, in kind of a paradoxical, strange way, there's some value in being ignorant in some of these cases. I would say that my film experiences doing genre work have been a little easier at times, in the sense that I've had people kind of guiding me and giving me lots of reference material to look at, And I think on a lot of the game projects that I've worked on, at least the more well-known ones, there's been less of that, and it's been more of a frontier, more like let's just make something completely new, and that's really hard to do. And I think that's part of why Hyperlight Drifter was such a challenging project, because I basically was not using any references at all. It was just making it up as I went along for the most part. And there were like one or two, there were things where I had an idea for something that was based on something else, like the eastern region, the western region of that game, this like dark brooding forest, and it kind of reminded me of this sequence in the beginning of Chrono Trigger. And so that was like kind of a touchstone for me for that. And there's a boss fight that I struggled with, and Alex, the creative director, like suggested this sequence from Dark Souls as a touchstone. So there were a couple of spots where we like got stuck, and we kind of used outside references to inspire us, but for the most part it was pretty much just like shooting from the hip. And like Fez was that was completely shooting from the hip. But that one worked out because I had a ton of music I'd already written that I never did anything with, and I just like would listen to all of it and look at the game and be like, does it work here? Does it work here?
Yeah.
And I ended up scoring most of that game just by connecting the dots, like with pre-existing music that I'd written.
That's awesome. Are there any, like, I guess, projects or scores that you feel like particularly proud of, or that you kind of like feel, I mean, I'm sure you're proud of all of them, but like that you feel like this is one I'm just really excited about, even after the fact?
Yeah, there's a couple for sure. I mean, I think the ones that were some sort of like step into a new direction for me, or demonstrated like I was able to tackle some sort of challenge, some sort of personal challenge. The ones that stand out to me the most are Mini Metro and Under the Silver Lake. I mean, for Mini Metro, basically I had made this game called January because I wanted to make a game. I was inspired, and so I've kind of taught myself using like a tutorial online to make a space shooter. I basically took that and turned it into a game where you lick snowflakes and it generates music. And I basically stumbled into Markov chains, which I didn't even know were a thing. Like probabilistically choosing notes based on previous notes, that kind of thing. And yeah, a game developer from New Zealand saw that and thought I'd be a good fit for their subway simulation game. And so that was like my opportunity to kind of like flesh out some of these ideas and really experiment with procedural music in a game context in a way that I'd never had before. And so, yeah, that was just like such an out there thing to do. And yeah, so it worked really well. It was not easy, but it worked really well. And it won the Independent Games Festival Best Audio, which at the time was, to me, like the most prestigious award that I could possibly win. So it meant a lot to me to win that award. And it just felt like, yeah, it was just really cool. It was a really cool project, and to have that opportunity. And then Under the Silver Lake was just the hardest thing I had ever done. And the fact that it worked out was somewhat surprising, but I was really proud of it. So and it took a really long time, over a year, and it was such an education. And some of those projects are not always super pleasant all the time to work on, but it's nice to be able to look back at some of those and feel like really proud of the work that we were able to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are there any I guess, like, video game or movie genres that you haven't yet worked on that would be that you'd be really excited to work on, right? That that you feel like would be a good next step for your music. And oh, it looks like we. Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No worries.
um, any genres? Any new
Yeah,
genres?
yeah. Just anything that you haven't like any styles that you haven't yet had a chance to kind of dip your toe into professionally that would really excite you to work on.
Hmm. I'm sure there would be. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but I mean, right now, like I have basically a huge backlog of things that I'm excited to do and finish that don't have anything to do with scoring. It's there's lots of software projects, and I have a couple of websites that I'm building, and like I'm doing some writing, lots of different kind of stuff. Um, but genres. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe like a really cool anime movie or something would be cool.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I don't.
I could totally see your stuff like with a mech anime would be really cool, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Cool.
am kind of curious because you mentioned like other projects like web design and writing and stuff. So it sounds like the stuff you start out with early in terms of just creating things has stayed with you, right? So you're kind of creating across the board, it sounds like. So
Yeah, I think so. Hmm?
oh,
Go
no,
ahead.
nothing. Go ahead. I was just gonna kind of follow that up by saying are there any aspects of those things that are just like that you find, I guess, really fulfilling in a way that like maybe you
Yeah.
don't always get on the music side?
Yeah, I think I like the diversity of things of doing different things creatively. I think it scratches different itches in my brain, and I also have not done a ton of self-directed work
Mhm.
the last 10 years or so. So I've been really appreciating the opportunity to do more of that. Even within the realm of like soundtracks, I mean, it was really nice to go from doing It Follows to Mini Metro, because that's basically I that was basically the order of operations with those projects, and they're like, they couldn't be more different. So I always liked being able to move in these, from project to project and just to be totally different. And I did a lot of experimentation. I worked at a game studio doing sound design, and I decided that wasn't for me. I did audio direction on a couple of projects. I decided that really wasn't for me either. I tried a lot of different things, and that's just kind of inherently what I like to do, is to experiment and explore, and to be making things, and to not feel like I'm limited to like making one particular kind of thing. Like I enjoy the freedom to kind of move around and try different things,
Yeah.
and be hard to pin down.
Yeah, no, that I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think you can even like hear it in the music, right? Just the way that the styles change and it just like adapts so well to whatever it's in. Um, I- do you? I guess like I'm trying to think of how I want to like word this. So when you're working in say something like whether it's web design, writing, or whatever it might be, do you feel like being in these different creative spaces like inspires you when you then move to another, I guess, creative space, right? So like when you're doing design over here, does that inspire the music or does that inspire the writing and that kind of thing?
I think so. I think the more that you work in different disciplines, the more like you have a possibility to kind of cross pollinate and
Mm.
come up with like ways to integrate abstract concepts and ideas that are normally associated with one medium into another medium. I
Mhm.
think that's where like a lot of really interesting things happen.
Mhm.
And I've always been really interested in that idea. I actually gave a talk one year at GDC at the AI summit. I'm not really sure why I was at the AI summit, but they asked me to talk, and I gave uh, they had this like micro talk kind of thing, and I gave this talk about just like basically data sonification, but taking data that's not really intended for sound or music, and coming up with ways to use it that would be novel and that would suggest intelligence in a place where there really isn't any, but that there's just, there's, for some people at least, there's, I think, a tendency to try to see intelligence in the noise, like to find some sort of pattern or meaning or something. And I was really interested in that idea at that time, as I was doing a lot of experimentation for Solar Ash. And like that, like a lot of that is kind of in that vein, this sort of idea of cross-pollinating things and basically hooking things up in ways that you're not supposed to hook them up, like crossing the red and green wire and hoping you don't blow up. I'm definitely into that, the potential there.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Do you I guess I'm kind of curious about your journey, because we kind of started out with like the stuff you started out, with as a kid, just kind of creating things, and then we've got the video game scores, film scores, and then you're doing these other creative projects and working with like AI and stuff. Are there any areas that you haven't yet had a chance to work in that would really excite you to work in, like any creative spaces?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned AI because I don't like, that was part of the joke for me, is like,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I guess the AI Summit at Game Developers Conference it's not like AI in the way that people think about AI now. It's more like the traditional way of thinking about AI in games. But that's actually a space that I'm interested in. I would be interested in like exploring more, like machine learning and that kind of stuff. And just sort of the idea of like evolution. That's like one particular thing that I've thought about doing more with, but I like I said, I have so many things that I've started that I haven't finished yet, and I'm like trying to focus on those. But yeah, so like, like in that realm, it's a lot of music software and tools and interactive things. I mean, certainly I would love to make another game at some point. We'll see what happens there. Yeah, I'm just I think doomed to always be wanting to make something different. So
Yeah, awesome. So one of the things I like to do is, because on these interviews, to a certain extent, you're kind of like limited to the questions I ask and the things that I kind of follow up on. But I always like to give like a few minutes, especially at the end, to just give you a chance to talk about anything maybe we didn't address, or something that's really exciting you that you wanted to bring up that maybe didn't come up in the questions. Yeah. So.
yeah, when people do this, I always have nothing to say. Yeah, I don't. I mean, because I think when people ask me questions, I usually go into a lot of detail. So I don't think I have anything else that's brewing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally fine. So yeah, so kind of here at the end, I just wanted to just give you a chance to mention any places where we can go. I mean, we've mentioned some things, but where we can go, like seek your work, like websites, social media, any of those places that you might want to plug here at the end.
Yeah, I have a website, disasterpeace.com, or disaster.pizza you can also use that. And I have a mailing list, and that's kind of where I do most of my communicating these days, and a pretty thorough blog. And occasionally I post things on YouTube, and that's about it as far as my internet presence goes.
Awesome. Well, I will post links to those in the video description, but I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to chat with us and be with us today. So thanks, Rich.
Yeah, my pleasure, Chris.